Local productions seen on Delta College Public Media are made possible with support from viewers like you. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Welcome to Junia Doan's The Spark. I'm Junia Doan, and thank you for joining us. My guest today is award-winning British author and critic D.J. Taylor, who is known for his expertise in literary biography and historical fiction. Welcome, David. You're very well known as a writer of criticism, a historical fiction, and literary or intellectual biographies. So I wanted to start with one that probably has your name on it prominently, and that is your writings on George Orwell and 1984 and the history of his life experiences and influences on his writing. How did you come to pick him when you started? This is almost a lifetime writing commitment.
Well, you're right. It is almost a lifetime writing commitment because I remember it's rather unusual because most people, I think, both in America and in the UK, come to Orwell through his two great novels, through Animal Farm, written in 1945, and 1984, published just before his death in 1949. But I was very unusual. When I was in, I think, about 12 or 13, my mother had a very small collection of books, very small shelf of books. And one of them turned out to be a paperback of Orwell's second novel, A Clergyman's Daughter, which I think even Orwell fanatics would not say that it was his greatest novel. But I read this at the age of 12 or 13, and it was the first kind of grown-up book that I'd read, if you know what I mean. And although the situations described in it were completely alien to me, it's about a woman who loses her memory living in rural Suffolk in East Anglia in the 1930s. And yet it spoke to me in a way that no previous book that I'd ever come across did. And that was how I got into Orwell. And I remember they call them O-levels in those days over here in England, public exams when I was 15. And the question on the English paper was, whose biography would you like to write? And I wrote about how I would like to write George Orwell's biography. And that is a very long time ago now. So I think you could accurately call it a lifetime's obsession.
How did you teach yourself or learn to write the evocative sentences you do and the multi-level comments you make in the course of a paragraph or a sentence?
That's a very good question, which I'm struggling to answer because I think one of the things that I think slightly makes me unusual, possibly as a literary critic and a biographer, which are two of the things that I do, is that I didn't do English at university. I was a historian, and it's not really fanciful to say that I'm more or less self-taught when it comes to writing about books and writing about the people who wrote them, because I didn't have any formal training, particularly in how to do that. And I suppose as in most of these things, I think most writers would say that they kind of pick things up, and you emulate people. And if you think you're going to be a biographer, then you read certain other biographies, and you kind of get a feeling of how they're done, and you kind of inch your way into writing about people. I mean, I didn't write a proper fully fledged biography until I was in my late 30s, when I wrote a book about Thackeray. But in some ways, this may sound disingenuous, but in some ways I don't really regard myself as a proper biographer, because when I write about people, it's because of how I admire them and sort of simply want to tell people how wonderful I think they are. So the book about Thackeray, for example, which was written, well, at the end of the last century, a quarter of a century ago now, And what I really wanted to do was to write a book of literary criticism, just telling everybody how wonderful I thought he was. And my publisher said that you're only going to sell about 3 copies of that, so write a proper biography. So I sat down and conjured up the skills to write a literary life, which I'd never previously done. So it was very much a sort of learning on the job experience, and I wouldn't say and I think I was sort of picking up tricks and picking up ways of approaching my subject almost as I was doing the book, so to speak.
What I admire about you as being one who just personally asks a lot of questions is the ability to reconstruct, you might say, the culture in which this person lived and functioned or didn't function, and the way it makes it easy to understand. So, who does all this research for you, or how do you go about that? Because now some of your fiction books are literally in different times.
Well, that's very kind of you. I appreciate that very much as a compliment. And I think the answer is that I do all my own research. I don't have if I were an academic working at American university, I'd probably have a team of research assistants. But I don't have any academic affiliation, so it's kind of all my own work. But I think that one of the great difficulties of writing, or one of the great challenges facing the biographer, especially now especially in the 21st century, when my own view of a lot of biography is that it strikes a very chiding note in that people are very quick to examine bygone lives in the context of their own lives and judge them by standards that perhaps they wouldn't have appreciated or even thought were relevant. And I always think that the life writer's duty is to see people in the context of their time. And to see them on their terms rather than your terms. And so, for example, were one writing about Thackeray, the subject of my first biography now, one would have to approach, you can't get away from the fact that Thackeray's views on, let us say, slavery were pretty equivocal. And when he toured the southern states of the US in the 1850s, he wasn't terribly distressed by some of the sights that he saw on the plantations in Savannah and places like that. But you have to, and that, to a modern sensibility, is dreadful. And yet, you have to, without excusing anything, you have to appreciate the context in which it was written. The English visit to America, observing the customs of a foreign place, and 170 years ago. So it's important to give these things context and not simply to sort of baldly state your own views of moral, social, and political questions in the 21st century. So it's a very difficult trick because I've read other biographers truthfully say that, however, in fact, the English novelist C.J. Sansom, who was famous for his Tudor historical novels, died the other month. And he said that he said that his modus operandi as a novelist was he tried very hard to recreate the past life that he was examining, while always being conscious of the fact that his own sensibility was going to intrude because he couldn't help it. And I think the same is true of the biographer. Ultimately, it's your sensibilities and it's your moral and political standpoints that are going to, in some cases, override that of the subject. But you have to try and see these people on their own terms. It's the only I think it's the only honest and scrupulous thing that you can do.
I've had a little discomfort with cultural history just because of my own life, and it seems here in America, I would say the culture changes subtly every 7 to 9 years. And so if you're going to write it the early part of my life, the culture is not what we have today in America. And so I'm asking myself, as a biographer, which I'm not, but I mean, how does a biographer figure out the culture? I know you read letters and this and that, but um, it just seems very difficult, in some sense, fiction. So, you know,
It
whatever.
is.
And I
It
try very hard to ask myself, and so I'm asking you, is how do you, like, for example, if I'm wants my opinion on things, I don't really like to give it until I've studied it. And not only studied it, but then I might try inside me to make the case for it or against it, because I just think it's more useful in understanding complexity. So I
I
don't know what you do, but how do you sanitize your point of view?
I tend to agree with you in that I mean, biography is particularly difficult because what is happening is a kind of almost a kind of collision between the modern sensibility that is writing the book, the past sensibility that the modern sensibility is rubbing up against, and the wider cultural context which that person has got to understand. I find this increasingly now when reading, say, English, well, and American novels too. I'm a great fan of American fiction in some cases. I admire it more than a lot of English novels, especially the historical ones. But I find these days when you read a British novel, even written just around the time of my, sort of written in the 1950s, not long before I was born, I find that you almost need footnotes to understand some of the historical, some of the incidental references. And the same is true of American fiction. And when you extrapolate from that and ask what the writing of a biography is like in those circumstances, you're as you said in your question, you're coming up against a whole series of immensely complicated and not easily penetrable moral and social and political codes. And so, getting some idea of the way, I mean, getting to take the thing down to its basics, down to its first principles, to get an idea of how family life, for example, worked 100 years ago in Britain is an extraordinarily difficult thing, and things that we might now find bizarre were wholly ordinary to the average British citizen of 100 years ago. And so you have to go back into your own memories, you have to go back into your own family life and think about your own past and your own family history, in the knowing, of course, that that's going to be substantially different from the family histories of the people you're writing about. But even so, there are points of consanguinity. There are points of reference there. So essentially, you're having to in your not necessarily on the page, but in your mind, as you're writing about bygone subjects, you're having to try and build up a whole world which you're ever more conscious that is receding further and further as you write, and you may have terrible trouble in getting to the depths, down into the depths of and understanding some of its code. So I find that a real challenge. I find it very interesting. And it means the biography becomes very localized. And I notice this sometimes with American readers of my, particularly say, let's say, the Orwell book, who, are fascinated by some of the social protocols on this grey and ask really detailed questions about, how Orwell got on with his parents or how he got on with his wives or the people he and the English novelist L.P. Hartley wrote a famous sentence at the beginning of a novel of his called The Go-Between, and it goes, "The past is a foreign country. They do things differently there." And they, the further back you go, the more different it seems. So it really is a challenge I rather relish, being fascinated by bygone English social history, but it becomes steadily more of a challenge the further you go back.
Do you introduce that sense of curiosity and enthusiasm to raising your children and their uh, intellectual development?
I've got three sons. The youngest is 24 now. They're all growing up, and I regret the fact that they've grown up. I used to love it when they were small. In fact, the house in which I'm sitting here now talking to you is, as far as I'm concerned, is full of ghost children. I see little 6-year-old faces popping up from behind sofas and chairs. But that is important, I think, what you say, because I'm interested, I suppose, both as a biographer and as a novelist, and I mean, just generally, I'm interested in quiddity, in idiosyncrasy, in what makes people the kind of people they are, and also, to add a note of determinism to it, the kind of people they will become. Because I'm a great believer in the idea of being able to see the seeds of people's intellectual or moral or political development in in their bygone lives. And so I suppose one of the fascinations of biography, to go back to what we were initially talking at, is finding those hints, seeing those seeds, looking at someone's very early life and drawing out a particular statement or a particular activity, a particular way of thinking or behavior that gives you some kind of clue to the people they ended up being. There's a rather flash word for all of this, which is teleology. Which should start off at the end of somebody's life or with the final achievement. People do this always with Orwell, 1984 being his final triumph, written just before he died, and then going back to the start and seeing if you can build up that wall of bricks that created the final edifice. So I'm a great believer in that. Yes, looking for those early signs of what is going to come subsequently.
And have you done that for yourself? If you were to look back 40 years or something like that, can you see how you have changed or developed?
Any person, any writer's answer to that can only be equivocal. The answer being in some ways yes, in other ways no. I mean, I was always from a very early stage in my life. I always wanted to be a writer. I could think of no more desirable. Well, actually, that's not quite true. Until I was about 20, I wanted to be an academic historian, and then I thought that I really didn't. It was becoming too sort of exclusive, and it would constrain me rather than sort of be a liberating factor. But certainly from a very early age, I always wanted to write books, and I couldn't foresee a more desirable destiny than to end up having written a shelf of books in the same way that a painter would want to create a gallery full of paintings. So there is that, and I don't know. I mean, I think it's very difficult. It's very difficult when you're young. I mean, my children tell me this. My sons tell me this. It's very difficult to think, beyond the next corner when you're a young person, because everything is so contingent. You're having to sort of forge a career. You're having to work out what you're going to do. You might be wanting to get married to something or something. Everything is happening very, very quickly. You're like a frog hopping over lily pads. Off you go, dancing from one situation to the next. And it's only when you have time to, you don't. I don't think you begin to see yourself in context. Or to use a Latin phrase, of specie aeternatis, in the context of eternity. I don't think you begin to see that until comparatively late on, and then you look back and start thinking about all the mistakes you made. And I've always one of my favorite novelists is the English novelist Anthony Powell, who wrote a marvelous 12-volume novel sequence called A Dance to the Music of Time. And Powell says that obviously life is predetermined or is determined because every step logically leads to the next step. The only problem being that you can't see the steps and the pattern that they're making. But I've always kind of thought that a decision leads to a decision leads to another decision, but you can't see the pattern until it's too late, which possibly is a good thing, because otherwise it would rob you of spontaneity and the ability to make to make adventurous choices.
I'm thinking about what you're saying as you say it, and I think one of the advantages of being older is so many of these challenging experiences replicate themselves in life, and so finally, when they happen, you have a different attitude, not surprised, but just handle it, make it do, work it out,
I
whatever, create
agree.
the opportunity, whatever it is. So I think for myself, I am a different person, somewhat, not in values, but in maybe sort of confidence about that I can handle whatever's going to show up.
I
And there
think
are a
that's
lot of things that do show up
That's a very good
unexpectedly.
point, I think. I mean, situations do replicate themselves. If they don't replicate themselves, they're reanimated in slightly different ways. And there is this sense that by the time you reach the age one has reached, you have dealt with various things, and it ought to be possible to deal with them again. And that there is a kind of comfort in that. Whereas when you're young, everything new situations are very scary because you've not previously kind of you've not had to face up for them. So I think that's a very good point. But on the other hand, I've got in the UK, yes, in fact, only yesterday here in the UK they were having a memorial service for Martin Amis, the great British novelist and critic. And I've got a cutting from an interview that Martin Amis gave a few years ago up on our fridge, and it says something like he says something like, you get to the age of 60 and you look around and you think, it's not been so bad, I've got on with my career, the children have grown up, they seem okay, I'm in reasonably good health, it's all okay. And then you think, but this is not going to end well.
Why? You the one that's going to die, but it may be blissful, it may be tortured. One doesn't know. I have a friend
Oh,
who said the only experience she hadn't had was death, and she was looking forward to it. So there you are. It's how you see
well,
it.
and again, it depends. The whole thing is open to such varied interpretation. I mean, Orwell, to go back to him, excuse me, had made a famous quote, and he remarked, um, "All life, on balance, is a succession of failures, and only the very young or the very foolish believe otherwise." And this was a man, who wrote one of the greatest novels, two of the greatest novels of the 20th century, but he believed that he had failed. And he also said he thought when he was dying, in his final illness, he remarked to a friend, "I've had it coming to me all my life." And so that's George Orwell. So, what hope is there for us lesser mortals, our minor workers at the coalface of literature and life?
And your opinion about it, one's opinion about it. So what haunts you?
What haunts me? These are very interesting questions, you're putting here. They're far above the usual level of the Orwell bloggers and the what haunts me. What haunts me, I suppose, is to a certain extent, along with Orwell, the consciousness of failure, of things one could have done that that one didn't do. I mean, I live a very complicated, I suppose one would technically call it a subjunctive life, the what if life. What if I'd done such and such? What if such and such a thing had happened? All the missed cues, the missed opportunities, the opportunities that didn't, that either didn't present themselves or you didn't, the alternative careers one could have pursued. I mean, for example, I was at I was at university all those years ago with several people who made careers of themselves in politics, for example, who nearly became prime ministers. I used to work as a freelance. I used to work for Boris Johnson when he was a magazine editor before he became prime minister of the UK. With all of that happened, and you think to yourself, in more exalted moments, in more roseate moments, you think, oh, I could have done this, I could have been that, I could have, Norman Mailer, I could have been a contender. And when you go back to thinking, but perhaps that wouldn't, given one's temperament, personality, interests, perhaps actually that wouldn't have been a good thing. And I referred earlier, I was quoting Anthony Powell, who in some sense is possibly one of my favorite English novelists, and he very illuminating said that in the end that he thought, and this was based on a lifetime's experience. This wasn't something he said when he was a young man, but he said that in the end, most, not all, but most people, a decent percentage of people, achieve the kind of life and the kind of lifestyle that is appropriate to them. They find the groove and they want to settle. Obviously, there are restless and dissatisfied people, and people for whom who never managed to sort of pick the threads out of the life's rich tapestry that's before them. But I do. Most people, I think, by the time they reach a certain age, are happy, are secure in their skins, and that's something to aspire to, I think.
True, I agree with you there. So how do you pick the next writing opportunity, big or small now?
But that's not quite as easy a decision to make as it sounds, because however distinguished or eminent or successful a writer you are, there are always the pressures of the commercial world lying out there to trip you up. And the older you get, the more difficult I think it is to write the kind of things that you really want to write. There are numbers, there are several people whose biography I would like to write, but there's just no real opportunity to write them. Have you heard of a Victorian English novelist called George Gissing? Is that the name familiar
No,
to you?
tell me.
Oh, well, I don't know. That's fine. No, because his reputation is fairly exclusive and largely confined to the UK. I would love to write about Gissing, but I know that no commercial publisher in England or America would pay me money to do so. Do you know the English novelist Ronald Furbank?
No,
Oh, no, that's okay.
I'm a flunky here.
He was one of the great dandy novelists, great influence on people like Evelyn Waugh. Died in 1926. Wrote these wonderful. He was very interested in the Harlem Renaissance. Actually, wrote a novel called Sorrow in Sunlight that's very influenced by all of that. And I know that no publisher in the Western world would pay me money to write Furbank, which is a shame because I love him and I'd like to write about him and tease out some of the idiosyncrasies and the qualities of his style, but it's not going to happen. So you have to find other projects. You have to find other things you want to do. In fact, I'm very fortunate because my next nonfiction project is going to be a book about J.R.R. Tolkien, whom I loved very much when I was younger. Great boyhood fan of his, and that will be an interesting thing to write about because it's not going to be a conventional biography. It's going to be more of a kind of in pursuit of, which would be interesting to sort of tease out things that I'm hoping that no one has previously teased out. So that will be good. But no, every time the new project comes around, you're endlessly recalibrating your own desires and ambitions.
So here's what David taught us: be individualistic, be responsible, do thorough research, listen with an inner ear and an open mind, and be wise, or try and be wise, which changes as you live it, I think. But anyway, aim for that, and it's been a real pleasure. Thank you so much, David.
To contact Junia, send her an email at juniadonsthespark@gmail.com. For more information, program schedules, and news about future guests, go to www.juniadonthespark.com. Thank you for joining us. See you next time on Junia Doan's The Spark.
Local productions seen on Delta College Public Media are made possible with support from viewers like you. Thank you.